Welcome to week 6 in Grief and the Architecture of Belonging. We are talking today about that fifth layer, country. And country is for us in North America would be a single country. So Canada, United States. If you're watching in countries around the world, it might be a collection of countries, such as the UK. And so it is whoever holds the highest governing authority over the people, not the country. So the United Nations would not be considered the highest governing authority for the great many countries in the world because it is not over the people, it is over the countries and their choices. So when we look at country, we're looking at patriotism, we're looking at defending and fighting or celebrating with a large group of people of which we will never meet. So it is coming together for a greater purpose. And that is the value of country. So here we are in Grief and the Architecture of Belonging, and we're looking at national and global grief. And this can be a lot heavier than a lot of our conversations have led to talk about because it is harder to measure. It's hard to measure grief of patriotism, grief of betrayal of government. And because of that, we don't have the conversations. So as with any aspect of our series, we start with a breathing exercise. And Suzanne, if you could lead us in that breathing exercise before we get into the heavy stuff so that we are better prepared to have this conversation.
Yeah, thank you. So today we're going to do what's known as the VU breath or the foghorn breath. And what is interesting and exciting to me about this one is we're actually creating vibration in our body with the sound that we're making. So that vibration then helps to calm the vagus nerve. So that's part of that parasympathetic system that we've been talking about a lot. We're trying to get out of the sympathetic system, the fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, and get into the system where our body knows it's safe. And that's where we want to be having these conversations from. So this exercise is very simple. You're going to take a long, slow breath in. So we'll probably do about a 4 count, and then a long, slow breath out. We might blend this with the other one where you take a longer breath out than in, because my system really likes that. So I get to lead up. That's how we're going to do it today. So we're going to do 4 in and 6 out. And on the out, you're going to make a low, it's almost like a hum, but you're going to do it with your mouth open. So it's literally VU is what you're saying. So the V, if you make that noise, you can feel the vibration start because it starts on your lip as you make that sound. The oo, you're going to say as an extended vowel on the lowest sound you can make, right? And nobody's listening, so you can experiment. You can make all kinds of weird noises. It's also referred to as the foghorn breath. So if you think of that sound of like, ooh, like that foghorn low sound, you can feel it. I don't know if any of you who live in oceany places like I do, where it's also foggy, we get very used to that sound. And I remember even as a kid being able to feel that vibration. It's that kind of low. If you think of like the boom, boom, boom of music, it's that on a sustained level. So it's not elevating our system like the boom, boom, boom does. It's that sustained low sound. So 4 in, 6 out, making whatever low sound you can. It's probably going to hear mine. So you're just going to have to give me grace as it sounds really weird. And that's okay. So here we go. Eyes closed or softened, I enjoy because you take away the visual distraction and that lets your body really settle. And if you can also relax into the chair, couch, whatever you're sitting on that's holding you, that's another signal to your body that you're safe. So I'm going to leave it to you to do all of that part. We're going to breathe in for 4 and then out with the VU. And in for 4, and really trying to have, when you do that VU, to really feel that vibration moving down your body. We want to try to get to our belly. And one more. Take a few more deep breaths. Let your breathing return to normal. Flutter your eyes open if you've had them closed. come back to whatever space you're in, and really think about, I could get my vibration down like to the bottom of my lungs. Didn't make it to my belly. That's okay. Then we know there's some tension there we're holding. We're just going to keep it as a practice, right? Getting lower and lower, allowing that whole system to feel that vibration. Before I throw it back to Annie to start our conversation, I want to make sure to introduce myself for those of you that haven't been watching. I'm Suzanne Jabour. I'm a grief coach, guide, and educator, author, writer, speaker, all the things about grief. That's where I play. And I come to that work after the sudden loss of my son almost 5.5 years ago, which feels unfathomably long and indescribably short at the same time. And that really set me down this path of deep consciousness of my emotions, because I knew if I tried to resist them, I would fall apart and or get sick. And really leaning into curiosity, because I didn't want to get stuck. I knew being stuck and feeling hopeless was not my permanent situation. And so I really had to lean into curiosity as that way to just stay a little bit in motion, a little bit aware of what might be possible now. What could I do next? Just those little tiny steps that keep us going and create ultimately our grief journey, which is how I ended up having fascinating conversations about grief and the ways it intersects with other ways of understanding, like this architecture of belonging that Annie has created and identified for us as a framework that we're using to work through this process. I'd love for you to start us off, Annie. It's, when you and I designed this arc and we talked about, we kind of came up with our talking points for each week. We had no idea, we were not fortune tellers that could see what was coming in the world. And it feels like this week has come up at such a rich time for us to be having this conversation about that sense of loss at the country, the national level. And then again, at the global level, we're seeing another war started this last week. For those of you watching this evergreen, this product will be available for a long, long time. We're recording on March 5th. So, war has broken out again in the Middle East with all kinds of consequences and ramifications for every level of our understanding, right? Because it is also making countries have to make a decision about whether to, how not to participate and what to say about that. It's helping us again see the ramifications of global things on our, as it ripples down through the other layers of belonging, right? As that architecture is, how is this impacting our community, our family, our household, ourself? And it's making, for me anyway, so clear the interconnectedness and the ripples of all of these layers. So I would love for you to just give us a framework of how you see this playing out, right now in history, and even in the past, 5 to 10 years. I think we're seeing variations on a theme. It's the same theme being played out over and over again. So yeah, get us started.
I'm Annie Emprima. I'm a metaphysical trauma researcher, but that was never what I wanted to do. I didn't wish to do that when I was a little kid. Where this came to be is a byproduct of my military experience. I was deployed in 2016 in the middle of the deployment. I say some to downplay it, some capabilities kicked in, and I found myself in a grand spiritual awakening in the middle of a deployment. So I have the background of being a military veteran, an Army veteran, as well as someone who is trained in psychology and trauma as a trauma researcher. And I look at the unspoken conversations that we're having with each other as humans in this layer of belonging. So we're looking at political division, as Suzanne had mentioned. We've got political division, and it's not just the United States with the red and the blue politics. It is world affairs. And so we're looking at crosses into cultural beliefs, whether we agree with them or not. Acts of terror. We have crimes against humanity. We have a lot of these things that are happening at the global level. And a lot of our conversation today is going to be about current affairs. But when we look at global events, as well, the pandemic was a global event. It affected multiple countries, and different countries had different ways of addressing it. Denmark, Sweden chose different approaches than the United States and Canada. So when we're looking at these larger things, are at the core of it is, do my highest governing politicians and leaders place my well-being first? And we're going to see that in this conversation today of a lot of pain and betrayal that can come, the grief that comes when choices are made that are not uh, with the intent of either protecting my safety as a member, a citizen of a country, or in the best interest of the growth of the generations to come. And that has an unspoken grief. It can really blanket an entire country in
Yeah.
either systemic oppression or systemic grief through generations. And so we're looking at larger scale grief today, and the global injury that we experience. I know as a veteran, when we pulled out of Afghanistan, and we did it in such a forceful way, that I think back of what was I there for? What was I there for? To help bring, I felt like I was serving a purpose. I was doing something that was benefiting both my country and that country. When I wasn't in Afghanistan, I was in Iraq, Qatar, Kuwait, and Jordan. And so it felt like we were trying to make things better. And then something like this happens, and it's really hard not to feel that pain of taking this band-aid and just pulling it off this wound and making everything so much worse. So there was this sort of veteran pain that I experienced in this large scale. So I want to pass this to you, Suzanne, and talk about the different ways that you're seeing it, because obviously my experiences are a bit different than yours. And being in two different countries, you're in Canada, I'm in the United States, how we're experiencing this global national grief and its different layers and forms from different perspectives. So what are some of the things that you're seeing on your end?
What's really fascinating to me is, because my lens is grief. So I have seen this grief for a long, long time. What's exciting to me is other people are talking about it too, right? People who aren't in the grief field as their profession or their curiosity or their hobby or their whatever are saying, okay, but hold on. I'm actually feeling grief about this, like that grief of betrayal, that grief of thinking you had my best interests at heart, but this doesn't feel like that. And, I want to really position this conversation as one of the human experience. So this is not tied to any political party that's in charge at the moment or not in charge at the moment and how you might feel about that. It's that sense that the people who are supposed to be protecting you and keeping you safe and acting in your best interests, to you, it doesn't feel like that. And it likely doesn't feel like that to a whole lot of other people. So we get this collective grief that, we end up kind of dismissing and playing down, but it actually is a really big burden on our systems if we're not appropriately naming it and dealing with it as grief. It is a loss of trust that might be playing out at all, as we watch these global events happen and national events happen. What's interesting is we see and feel that grief at all the other layers too, right? Because you might find out there's a family member who actually thinks they feel very safe and they don't understand why you don't feel safe. There might be someone in the community who's very vocal about how safe and amazing they feel when you feel really betrayed, right? So as things happen on these bigger levels, they ripple through and we feel them at multiple levels. So if you don't feel it at the global, if we're talking about this country global level and you're thinking, well, I don't feel that, you can look at the other layers and try and almost accordion them. So play out, okay, but is that showing up in this layer? Is it showing up in that layer? Is it showing up closer, right? The difference, I think, between Canada and the US right now is that I think generally we feel a bit more unified. There definitely are, we have our parties are very simply labeled. There are the liberals and the conservatives. It's not hard to tell who's who. And there always will be a divide between those two systems of belief because they're different systems of belief and belief about how you should run the country and what the priorities should be. We seem to, at this point, have managed to maintain some level of ability to talk between each other. It's definitely not what it used to be, but it's not to the level that it is in the US right now, where that feels like, you're across the Grand Canyon from each other. And interestingly, our identity as Canadians has yet again coalesced and unified around not being from the US and not being the US, which, I worked in the film industry for many, many years. And one of my favorite jobs was to drive people around. So I got to drive around in circles having fascinating conversations, most of the time with folks from the US, because people would be coming up from LA or coming from wherever they were coming from. And often people would ask about, like, what is the Canadian identity? Like, surely it's not beavers and maple syrup and Mounties. And I'm like, no. And it makes me crazy that that's like what we export as our image. Really, a fundamental part of our identity is not being the US. It's a core part of our belief system. And what's interesting is we held for my entire lifetime that we were not that, but we were really close friends with that. And what we've seen happen in the last year is we are no longer close friends. We are now, at best, neutral neighbors, at worst, pretty fractious neighbors that are arguing about the fence line, right? And arguing about whose garbage can is on the wrong side, right? So that's been a really interesting country level grief that I think a lot of people are really feeling because we've had very fluid borders. We have people who live on one side and work on the other, where part of the family lives on one side and part of the family lives on the other. There has not been that sense of a hard border and a hard us and them mentality, really, even though we are fundamentally have identified for decades and generations as not being from the US. So it's really interesting to see that shatter. And then we're seeing that playing out now with the most recent war, where countries are having to pick a side of who are you, are you, Spain just announced the other day they will not allow the US to use their airfields. They're like, no, we are not participating. You are not dragging us into this. Canada's taken a slightly different position for now, a little bit more conciliatory. But it's interesting to watch that play out at the global level. And then the complexity plays out again when you think about what's actually happening in Iran, particularly, where a very problematic regime has shifted. I don't want to say ended because we don't know what's next or who is next. So there is that sense of celebration. I was on a call with some Iranian friends the other day, and that's, she was celebrating like that leader is no longer the leader, and really grieving that what that means for her friends and family who are still there is they are now bombarded by airstrikes. They don't know what the government is going to be. There's so much uncertainty and actual danger that it's really this, it's the both and of it all. And that's, I think, the important thing for us to understand about grief. There is no either or. Grief is a both and kind of experience. So you can be pleased about one thing and grieving another thing at the same time. And that's important to understand because it means that we don't have to only hold one thing. And we don't have to think, well, like, I don't want to be sad all day, so I don't want to acknowledge my grief. That's not how grief works. You can be grieving and laughing and grieving and thoughtful and grieving and curious, right? There's just so much going on right now. And a lot of it is grief.
Yes. And the entanglement, that's a great point that you make with entanglement because we live, especially in the United States, if you're against this, you must be for this. And there's no nuance, there's no spectrum, it's very binary thinking, which is in fight, flight, freeze, you are either safe or you're not safe.
Yeah.
There is no moderation of it. So we very often forget the yes and. Yes, I can be in grief and also very grateful. I can be very scared and also feel very sure of myself in this capacity. And that is a huge part of healing too, that we don't talk about. To be able to have that emotional maturity to hold two emotions that seemingly oppose each other, to be happy and sad at the same time. um, to feel very disappointed but very grateful at the same time. And that when we're not prepared for it and we're in fight, flight, freeze, and we're being forced to experience something. And I say forced because if unless we're living isolated in the top of a mountain, if we are participating in this social media or we're trying to stay connected digitally, it's hard to avoid not being exposed. So we can't sterilize our life if we want to use digital technology to connect to our loved ones.
Yeah.
That we have to be willing to take on some of those nuanced emotions and to feel the grief, because this is not what we're in right now is not sustainable for our nervous system at a humanity at a human species level, not individual but collectively. It's not sustainable. And I know, like, we've had in the past weeks, we've talked about other topics, like here in Las Vegas, especially where I live, we had the housing crisis because we're a tourism dependent city. So we had, when tourism went down, people couldn't pay bills, housing crisis, overextended, the real estate market was unstable. And then we had the pandemic. So people have been fighting, even though we're not in famine and we're not in war, we've been fighting to survive. And now we've got a really high rent across the United States, and especially in the cities, that is not sustainable to the minimum wage ratio. And there's a grief. So we're feeling these layers of grief and layers of grief, and then it becomes complex grief. And we're not talking about complex grief.
Yeah.
And complex grief is heavy and it goes into our body and becomes diseases and disorders. And I'm going to say something very controversial for those that are watching that come from neuroscience or the medical community. I have never met someone with fibromyalgia that didn't have complex chronic grief in their history. So we have certain diseases that just affect our musculoskeletal system, that affect our nervous system from unprocessed grief. And this, because it's not, there's no funeral to these stories, it's a lot harder to have a ceremony to bury them, to release them, because it's not even being talked about. It's not even being labeled in our mind to be able to sort it, to know how to do this. We're just carrying it, and it stacks and stacks and stacks. So I, I next week we're going to be talking about belief system, and I think that also we can step into social injustices as well. But social injustice also affects us at the national level, and I know we've got some pretty big tensions going on right now, racial tensions, religious tension. Are you seeing that also in Canada?
We are, it's again, it's to a lesser degree.
Sure.
Um, but it's present for sure, for sure. Um, and what's interesting, I posted a reel a while ago about what had happened we had a small town that had a mass shooting, and I talked about it, I think last week or the week before. But I posted a reel about it, and some people said some things as comments on the reel that I was not okay with. And it was really interesting to feel into, okay, how do I respond? Like, what of this is mine to own? Really, none of it. Like, how you respond to my reel is none of my business. And at the same time, it was a reel where, for whatever reason, it elicited some transphobic comments.
Mm-hmm.
And I wasn't prepared to leave those sit there. And I thought, well, I can hide them because my post, I can just hide the comments. And I thought, well, I don't want to hide them. That feels weird. And, like I'm shutting down the conversation, which is the antithesis of what I keep, saying to people. We need to be having these conversations and opening them up. But I had to be really thoughtful about how to reply, because it is that sense of, you can have I have no issue really fundamentally with anybody having whatever belief system they want to have, until that belief system harms others.
Sure.
Until that belief system, they're trying to make me have it too. And then we're crossing a line. right? That I'm not prepared to, that like a line that I want to hold. So it is that interesting sense of, when we have these divides and these different belief systems, and that's, what we'll get into next week, how do we hold the both and? I think is a really tricky thing for us right now because I really wanted to just be like, you're an idiot and that's stupid. But that's not opening up a conversation, right? And so I had to be really thoughtful about acknowledging, yeah, I get that that's your belief system and that's totally fine, except, in this circumstance, that's actually not true.
Mm-hmm.
So you can believe what you want to believe, but you don't get to spew hatred about based on your belief system was the line that I kind of tried to draw. So yes, next week will be a very rich and juicy conversation. I think the way we're seeing it play out in Canada is quieter, right? Which is always the way. We're the quiet neighbor. You all are much better at being loudly patriotic, loudly dysfunctional, loudly boisterous about all things, and we tend to just be quieter. So I think it's a misunderstanding to not see that we have very similar divides, right? We have one set of beliefs in the cities, one set of beliefs in the West, different beliefs in the rural areas. We have the provinces, which feel like, a little bit like the sort of flyover states, very similarly disconnected from the big cities of the coast. And then for us, we have sort of our big cities of the coast would maybe be like Vancouver and Toronto, Montreal. And then we have all of Atlantic Canada, which is a whole different thing. So we really do have those same divides. We are less loud about it, and I think we're less um
You have less trauma.
I
Our
was going to say
country has
it's
trauma.
like less
Well, let's just
harmful.
name it.
It's
We
less
have the
harmful. Yeah, we're creating less trauma.
yes, yes. Loud does not mean healed.
No, but what's really interesting is to acknowledge that we have been able to be that country because we have lived left next to the loud people that get all the attention. So we could just quietly go about our business. So there has been a benefit to us, to the US being, loudly on the global stage, whether you agree or disagree with anything that has happened, loudly on the global stage, loudly activating, being participants in actions all around the world. And we can just, show up as the UN Peacekeeper Corps. Like we're a very active part of that, right? So it has really allowed us to hold this identity of really being able to be more united because we have had to make less bold, hard decisions. We're starting to make them now, right? We're seeing really interesting things happening on the global stage with countries that are not the US, right? Where Canada is taking very definitive positions about how it thinks the New World Order might play out. For example, in Davos, our prime minister made a speech that has, rippled around other parts of the world. We're seeing different decisions being made in the EU about how are we in relationship with the US? How do we want to be in relationship with other countries, with other trading zones, with other whatever? Like that world order really is upended at the moment, which also creates a bunch of grief and uncertainty because as dysfunctional and not great for everybody as the old system was, it was what we knew. And we knew our roles, we knew how to play the game. There's a level of comfort even in the dysfunction that we don't have anymore. So that's another thing to be grieving.
And it's hard to heal. When we're looking at grief, it's hard to heal at the individual level when something was caused at such a collective level. A collective injury usually takes collective level healing. And if we're not yet naming it as a grief, like for instance, 25 years ago, we had 9/11 in the United States. And so there's a date, there's a ceremony. We have every year, 9/11, we have a ceremony. And so we have this memory, and we also have the ceremony to honor that memory. There's a collective honoring of this event. But what happens when we're going through these major events? Like we talked about the pandemic, there was no official end date to the pandemic. So our entire country here, and I know other countries leaned on herd immunity, and they had different approaches, Middle Eastern countries and some European countries, they just moved forward and they didn't really have the trauma that the United States had, especially because we had such an abrupt, everything shut down, mask up, 6 feet. And there was this uncertainty and fear that came with the grief of changing our normal, the definition of normal, big abrupt fracture, but there was no healing of the fracture. There was no, okay, everyone, we're now going to come back and we're going to do our best to have a new normal. There was no conversation. It just, we kept marching forward, and our nervous system never said, hey, we need to close this out. So there was never an official end date to say, all right, stand down, nervous systems, collective nervous systems, you can all breathe now. We just kept marching forward with that same pain. And so the grief is sitting on our shoulders and in our lungs, and it's still unnamed. It still has no expiration date. It still has no stand down order. And so we just keep adding. And I talk about this adding and adding, which means it's going to take a much larger approach to heal the people. And I don't know that I've heard that conversation at all across the mental health side, across the political arena. No one's even looking at the amount of grief that a society is carrying and the responsibility of that same political leadership to be a part of the healing of that country or that region. When I look at from trauma and I look at the levels, the ripples of the effect of grief, we have to be in ratio. The depth of the grief versus the approach of healing has to match. I don't know what the right answer is to help heal grief at this level. It's going to be a unified answer. What would be an ideal way to approach this?
Yeah, I think the ideal at the moment is unattainable, right?
Yeah,
Because as you're saying, the
true.
ideal would be that we all come together as a country or as a, an EU or as a UK or whatever. We all come together, we have some kind of ceremonial something, right? The same way we do for the world wars. Like we still have Veterans Day, November 11th,
Mm-hmm.
come together to remember, yes, the two world wars. And then I think most places have layered on the conflicts they've participated in since. So we have that moment of acknowledgement and collective healing, and that moment of, everybody pausing, hopefully, not just taking the day off. And I think it does require something at that bigger level. And I don't think we're going to get that anytime soon. So what we can do is create that effect in our spheres of influence. So we could have a conversation among our friends and family, for example, to say, you know what, I'm really realizing I'm holding a lot of grief at levels that are way bigger than me, right? There's grief about the economies right now. There's existential grief about how does the world even work? There's grief for the environment. There's grief for the wars. There's grief for the political divides. Any way you want to name it, there is grief there. So what if we came together as a community and had a conversation about these griefs that we're feeling? Because I also think when we're doing the healing, it ripples the same way as the trauma.
Oh, absolutely. The
Right?
same way
So
we hurt is how we heal.
yeah. So if we
Directionally.
can see it first in ourselves and understand that we are carrying that grief, and then find other people that know they're carrying that grief, invite in people who might not be sure, but they're feeling something. They don't know what it is, but something's going on. And maybe people who are just feel sad or tired, and all have a conversation about, for me, it can be really effective in groups to start at the pandemic. Because for most of us, that's the first big global event we've lived through, right? For me, that was the first one. And it's such a time marker. Everybody remembers when that hit their life. At whatever point in that March it was, we remember, right? When our trip got canceled, or when we were told to stay home from work, or when, like for me, when I flew my kid home from across the country because I wasn't sure I was going to be able to get her home, right? We all have that starting point. And you can look from then on and almost do an inventory of what are all the losses, not necessarily of people, because we know those and we acknowledge those. It's all the other ones. So it's the vacations, it's the graduations. Like in that lockdown period, we all lost a whole bunch of things that we never grieved.
Yeah.
Because the collective conversation was just about get back to normal, get back to normal. We're going to get back to normal. Next week's going to be normal. Ooh, we were wrong. Well, let's try the week after, right? There was no closure, and there was like postponed closure that then never closed too. That's how it played out in Canada anyway, where it was like, okay, we think we're going to try these adjustments. Ooh, no, that was too much. We got to pull everything back in because we're watching the numbers spike and the hospitals are back overwhelmed. So we got to pull it back in. And And then we can look from there at all the things that have happened since. There is plenty to grieve in the time since the pandemic started till now. And if we're just having those conversations and acknowledging it and acknowledging that we have some big feelings about that, that starts that healing process. And if we can do it at the friends and family or at the even slightly bigger community level, then that ripples into other communities because we're all cross-linked, right? So I take my conversation from this community to the next community and I say, I was just part of this really interesting conversation. I wonder if we want to have it here. That,
Grassroots healing.
right? That to me is how we're going to see this bigger level healing, because I don't think it's going to come from the top down because it's too unsafe. Because for the
Ooh.
powers that be to acknowledge they have done harm is not safe. It doesn't make you electable.
It
I
doesn't
have
make
harmed you. You should
powerful.
vote for me again. Not going to work. So I don't know in our current structure that we're going to ever see that. But we can initiate it in our communities and create that ripple butterfly effect.
I love this. I love this. And perhaps that's the greatest takeaway we have for this whole 8-week series is that acknowledging grief and then finding our own way to be a part of healing from the inner layer out.
Yeah. And really looking at extending it at that community level. Because these collective griefs, we can't heal them by ourselves. I can heal how I approach it. Like I can be very self-responsible, but I can't heal that collective field on my own. So we can do it in our community and then let that ripple to the next community and let that ripple and let that like create that ripple effect to create the bigger change that we want to see.
What a powerful way. What a powerful way to be a part. What a powerful way to be useful in a society.
Yeah.
And I use that word very intentionally because useful is a word that appears in Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning.
Mm-hmm.
And when we understand our contribution and we understand the depth of pain that we're carrying, we then understand also our capacity to be a useful part of the healing process.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And none of that can happen if we're all pretending everything's okay and that normal is good.
No, no, we have to name it. We have to honor it.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's a great way to end this conversation. Do you want to do the reflection questions or should I?
Doesn't matter. I
All
have them
right.
in front of me. You want me to go?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. So as always, we thank you so much for watching. If you're watching the recordings, feel free to put a comment. We'll be monitoring those and replying. Those of you that are here in the room, again, our endless gratitude, and we'll have our, opportunity for Q&A and comments when we're done recording. But we always want to leave you with something to ponder, right? Because listening for 40 minutes and then going back to normal is not going to shift anything. So your ponder questions for this week. In what ways has the grief of my country or the world changed the way I move through my daily life, even in subtle ways? So we're looking for the small ways that that sense of grief for something beyond your control, outside what feels like your sphere of influence, is impacting you in your day-to-day life. Think about that. Come join us again next week. We'll be talking about the grief at sort of the belief systems level. So we're getting way out to the systems level and how that impacts us and all the layers in between. And we hope to see you then. Anything else you want to say, Annie?
No, thank you for watching and we'll see you next week.